Joining us now is the housing researcher for the New Economics Foundation, Hanna Wheatley. Hello, Hanna.
Hiya.
Good afternoon to you.
So your proposals are that we kind of go back to rent controls, more regulations, but they don't seem to be quite as forthright as they were back in the 1980s when Matthew and I benefited from them when we were almost as poor then as we are now.
So our proposals today, which we've come out with in a report, which has been picked up by Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, is echoing a lot of our recommendations in his report. So we're calling for a new model of rent control for London, allowing the Mayor to have the powers to reduce rents, first of all, on the basis that they're already too high, and then to control them in an ongoing way. In London, we've got people spending on average 43% of their income on rent, and that's obviously an average, so in some places that's up to kind of 80-90%. And the UN and Shelter and lots of other charities say that an affordable amount of your income to be spending on rents or on your house is 30%, about a third. So we're seeing way higher than what's deemed affordable. So rents in London are out of control, and we're proposing rent controls as part of the solution to that.
Well, presumably you'd like to see similar controls around the country. Other cities are pretty expensive for people to live in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we really hope that today is the beginning of a conversation about rents and housing pressures all around the country. This piece of work was specifically looking at London. So we've looked at cities all around the world and analysed the different rent control measures that they have to try to come together with something that would work for London in London's specific context. But we really hope that it starts a conversation about what can be done in other cities, and what the main thing that we're calling for today, because obviously the Mayor's calling for this as well, but he doesn't actually currently have the power to implement it. So a big question for us is, should the powers to set rents and set a rent control and decide measures that make rents and housing affordable be devolved to a mayoral level, and so giving kind of, because rents and housing pressures are such a localised issue.
When the way you're explaining it now, I'm sitting there thinking, I can't believe it's not been devolved already. I mean,
it is in so many other places.
Could you tell me, Hanna? I hope to drop this. I hate to drop this one on you, but I mean, as someone who benefited from rent control, rent review in the 80s, I vaguely remember Mrs. Thatcher axing it, as she axed so many benefits that were around at the time. But I can't remember why. Was it landlords were outraged that they weren't getting enough return on their investments?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of part of a broader system of deregulation of the housing market that we saw in this country and in lots of other countries. And so after kind of quite strong regulation after the war, we then saw the kind of sweeping deregulation, and that was Thatcher and a kind of and a broader movement in politics around the world.
She also introduced the right to buy. People are being allowed to buy their council houses. I'm just trying to get a historical window on the issue of rent, and I'm trying to think. Taking your cue that Thatcher looked at deregulating housing, and right to buy was part of that, do you think our culture in this country, our attitude towards renting and owning property, changed in the very early 80s with Thatcher, and that maybe we're still dealing with that legacy today, that that the endless demands we hear from younger people is, we can never afford to buy our own house, but actually after the war people didn't expect to own their own house?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really different to other places in Europe and around the world. We've got a really kind of strong pressure to buy homes, and that's been really incentivised by the government, who have encouraged that through various different kind of methods, as you said. But lots of other places like Germany have a much bigger rental market. And in London, what we're seeing now is that proportion of people who are renting in the private rented sector is soon going to overtake the proportion of people owning their homes outright or with a mortgage. And so it's a massive kind of shift that we're seeing at the moment of increasing. Yeah, it's like 2.4 million people in London's private rented sector now. And that is a sector that is the least regulated in all of Europe and the most expensive. And so what we're seeing is an increasing number of renters calling for rent controls. And so I think the Mayor looked at some polling that said that 63% of Londoners are in favour of rent controls. So we're really clearly seeing that people are crying out for a kind of switch in the way that we see the housing market, so that we're treating houses as homes instead of assets.
Is anyone listening? I mean, is government listening? Or the Federation of Landlords or whatever they might call it, do they listen? Is anybody open to these ideas? Anybody with the power to change?
Well, it's really, I mean, for us, it's really exciting that the Mayor of London has come out in favour of these. And the things that he's proposing today are add up to a rent control that is one of the strongest. But a
Labour Mayor facing a Tory administration, quite possibly headed up by an old Etonian public school boy, suggests doesn't necessarily mean Sadiq's going to get his own way.
No, of course. And so, yeah, there's a big task ahead of us for all of us who are kind of in favour of this, to work together to put the pressure on and to kind of help to organise renters, which is happening in a really exciting way in London at the moment and in other cities, where renters are coming together to organise and to demand through unions, through, like, for example, the London Renters Union, to demand a fairer, safer, more accessible rented sector.
Yeah, points taken, Hannah, but at the risk of not seeming to stand up for the underdog, I recall that when Maggie Thatcher brought in her reforms, what part of them was to the landlords said they were being crippled by sitting tenants who'd been in these buildings for eons and were paying, knock-down rents for expensive places. What about the landlords? I mean, is there a danger that your reforms could end up being unfair to those poor put-upon people?
Let me find my box of tissues. I can feel some tears coming up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, to be fair, there are landlords that own one other property that they bought in the hope that would see them into retirement. I'm thinking more of your sort of your multi-property owning landlords.
Question is do you want to be fair to landlords as well?
Yeah, so I guess there's clearly a balance to strike about the level that the rent control is set at. We wouldn't want to be in a position where we're penalising, individual landlords. But it is also true that any kind of rent control that deals with affordability in a really meaningful way will have an impact on landlords. At the moment, it's not clear what kind of impact that would be. Rent controls around the world exist and operate in really different ways, so it's not totally clear yet what that would be. There's also been a huge number of tax changes in the last few years that have had impacts on landlords, and we haven't yet seen because one of the fears is that landlords might sell up. And so we haven't seen that in the UK and in London in the last few years. But I guess the kind of broader point is the need to change the way that we think about housing, so that it's not just about kind of investment, and so that it's about homes.
Yeah.
And I totally get the point about pensions, and there's also stuff that we definitely need to look at in terms of stagnating wages and pensions, and we need to have an economy that doesn't mean that people need to treat housing as an asset and as an investment.
Hanna Wheatley,
so there's a lot of unpicking to do.
Have to leave it there, but a fantastic case I think you made there, Hanna Wheatley, for some form of rent control.